On this
Yeah.
day, 14th of May, 1955, what do we have?
This is lovely, this is lovely Soviet propaganda. This is how they always used to frame things. To all peace-loving states were allowed to join.
Moorhouse, welcome to another edition of History Book Buffs on this day. Now, on this day, 14th of May, 1955, what do we have?
We have the signature of the Warsaw Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance, otherwise known
Wow.
as the Warsaw Pact.
The Warsaw Pact.
The Warsaw Pact. Apologies. Yes, the Warsaw Pact, which is a funny one because, I suppose my general, as you might, readers and listeners might know, listeners and viewers might know, I'm a little bit older than you. And Warsaw Pact kind of loomed very large in my youth. It was like there was scarcely a news report on the evening news that didn't mention the Warsaw Pact. And I remember the first time I went to Warsaw was in 1991. And I remember getting off the plane and you got into the bus like you sometimes do in Eastern Europe. And they sort of bust you to the terminal. And the terminal was literally like this little shed. This is before Warsaw became, the world capital that it is. But then it was really primitive and it was literally like a shed. I remember thinking then very clearly, this is like the Warsaw of the Warsaw Pact, right? Like it was kind of this thing that was in our minds as being this great military power. And then you actually go there and it was like, really? So... yeah, it's loomed very large.
Isn't that a wonderful metaphor for the entire Soviet project, Roger Moorhouse?
Yeah, I think it is.
They managed to project this image to the world of something of technological, military and economic sophistication, and it was all just...
It was all just a shed.
It was all just a shed. It was just...
yeah.
Some slightly unhappy
right.
Soviets in a shed.
Yeah. I think that's very true. I think that's very true. So anyway, no, we're talking about the Warsaw Pact, and like we were saying, it's kind of remarkable that we, in our extensive preparation for this podcast, we were saying like it hardly gets a mention. I mean, the Warsaw Pact does obviously, but the formation of the pact and so on doesn't really get a mention. So
I was completely actually astonished, Roger, because both of us were kind of, as we do, we go to the books that we rely on. So I, for example, went to my the Taubman biography of Khrushchev, which I think is one of the best biographies I've ever read, and he doesn't really talk about the pact at all. I mean, obviously, he talks about it when it exists, and things happen, and the pact is invoked, whatever, and particularly when we come to like 56 or whatever, and the kind of the aftermath, but not very much at all on the formation of the pact and the reasonings behind the pact, and the same again in my very trusty Anne Applebaum's Iron Curtain. Nothing really.
And it is nonetheless a significant moment, right? It is a significant moment for the reasons we'll talk about.
It's hugely significant. It's one of the most significant moments, really, of the 20th century, because the entire second half of the 20th century is dominated, as you say, both in the headlines and in reality, by a theoretical kind of confrontation within Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. This is it. These are the lines. They're drawn.
Yeah.
So let's we'll do it, okay? All these other people who haven't put enough about it in their books, we're going to do it in brief today. So this is a short history with buffs, just long enough for a very, very quick dog walk. So set the scene, Roger Moorhouse. It is, I think we need to start, really, don't we, with this story in 1953. What happens in 1953?
1953, death of Stalin, obviously, which we've dealt with before to some. Well, we talked about the secret speech, didn't we? But death of Stalin in 53. So that whole edifice of Soviet power which start, the establishment of which, both in the Soviet Union and its expansion beyond, had been overseen by Stalin and masterminded by Stalin, that, potentially begins to crumble with Stalin's death. And then the whole question of the succession and, how do you sort of follow on from Stalin, who takes control, all of that. And allied to that, and sort of a corollary of that, is the question of what happens in Germany, right? Germany looms very large in all of this as well, because Germany at this point is divided by between the great powers. It's still under full power occupation. Those zones of occupation are kind of ossified by this point. So you've got the emergence, of a West Germany. In 1949, you've got the emergence of West Germany, you've got the emergence of an East Germany, but they're still effectively under, not say occupation, but with foreign armies and so on in situ, and the situation in Germany is still very much in flux in the early 1950s. So you've got, various offers are made by the Soviets, which, whether they are sincerely made or not, I would suggest not, but there's various offers to sort of solve the German problem, as it were, by offers of neutrality. Everyone would withdraw, Germany would be neutral, and it'd have pan-German elections and all this sort of thing, which the Western powers basically reject.
And there is still, though, this idea in the early 50s, isn't there, that you might end up somehow with a reunited Germany, but a kind of defanged reunited Germany. And this is, I think people who are new to all of this will be quite surprised, because we kind of have it in our heads that, East Germany and West Germany were things almost immediately after the end of the war, but it doesn't quite work like that. It's an ongoing sort of political limbo, isn't it, about what to do with Germany for years.
It's a sort of a gradual sort of crystallization, I suppose, of those lines. And this is where I think the Warsaw Pact Treaty comes in, and why it's significant is because it's like the final crystallization, that sphere of influence, that's the Soviet sphere. It will go no further without violence. But those countries that are behind the Iron Curtain are staying there, right? That's sort of the final delineation.
Right, but it's a crystallization effectively of the status quo, right? There's nothing, it's not, there's no movement, there's no sort of real, if you're sitting on the ground in any of these countries, you don't notice a change. But what it effectively does is create the state of East Germany within an alliance ruled by Moscow, right?
Yeah. So if we with that background, let's have a look at the day itself, shall we?
Yeah, although we should mention that 10 days before the day itself, that there is what's effectively the catalyst, which is that West Germany joins NATO, right? So that is also a tacit acceptance by the West that West Germany is not, that there will be no united
Germany.
There's no
flux. The flux is over.
There's no flux. The flux is over. Yeah. So West Germany joins NATO, and that is both a catalyst to for the Soviets to kind of crystallize what's going on, but it's also, as we know, NATO is deeply, deeply triggering and sensitive for the Russians. Its existence is kind of triggering because it implies that the Soviet world is a belligerent entity to be contained. I mean, reasonably.
Yeah.
But the Soviet, there's this sort of strange, all through the history of the Cold War, there's this kind of, very strange tango between the Soviets as aggressors and the Soviets as beleaguered and defensive, and where NATO fits into all of that is absolutely central. So 10 days before the accession of Western Germany to the NATO project is seismic for the Soviet project.
And this is the thing, it is to a large extent, it's all about Germany, right? Austria was also, this is, little known. these days people forget about the Cold War anyway, but Austria was also subjected to a four-power occupation by the powers, and Vienna was as well, like Berlin was, right? But that was also solved by the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which was a couple of weeks after the event we're talking about, was signature of the Warsaw Pact. So, essentially they managed to resolve the problem of Austria, and the point being that nobody cared about Austria, right? It didn't matter. Germany mattered. There's a line, I think it's from Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, who said, he who controls Berlin controls Germany. He who controls Germany controls Europe, right? And he's not
Yeah.
entirely wrong. I mean, in grand strategic terms, the size of the German economy, Germany's, physical space in Central Europe, its political power, its economic power, all of those things mean that Germany is the playground that both, superpowers in the Cold War want to control. And that's essentially why there's no German state treaty like there's an Austrian state treaty, because it's just too important to both of them. Neither of them can let it go. Neither of them can let the other one have it. So they end up dividing it. And this, as I've said, is kind of one of the last, pieces of the jigsaw which makes that division.
Yeah. Amazing that it's like 10 years after the end of
Yeah.
the war in Europe, isn't it? That it takes this long for things to actually be codified. I guess because the problem is so intractable. Right, let's get to the day itself. So we are in Warsaw, the clue's in the name.
Yeah. Warsaw, of course, will still be in a bit of a mess because, there's, massive destruction of Warsaw at the end of the war and previously, but particularly, during the Warsaw Rising. So Warsaw will be a mess. I mean, actually, one of this palace that they use, which is now the presidential palace, which is right in the middle of Warsaw. It's on Nowy Świat, for those that know Warsaw, right next to the Hotel Bristol. So currently the presidential palace. It had been, historically speaking, it had been the palace of the Radziwiłł family, so one of the great Polish families. So it's one of those old palaces. It was crucially, and for this reason, it was actually relatively untouched by the damage elsewhere. So that might have been one of the reasons why they used it. Anyway, I have actually been inside as well. I did a tour of the presidential palace a few years ago. So I actually stood in the room where they signed the Warsaw Pact, which was, I got a frisson sitting
You were in
there.
the room where it happens.
I was in the room where it happened, just like Hamilton. Yeah.
Brilliant.
That's the only thing I've got in common with Hamilton. But yeah. So that was quite fun. Yeah. Now the treaty was signed by the USSR, obviously, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the GDR, so East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Hungary, so the Eastern Bloc. And it was formally a treaty, as I said at the top, of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance. So it kind of, at first sight, it mirrors NATO in that sense, right? It's a military alliance in which, an attack on one was considered an attack on all. In the blurb and the like preamble and everything else that surrounds the treaty, they talk about the treaty being open to all peace-loving states. This is lovely, this is lovely Soviet propaganda. This is how they always used to frame things. To all peace-loving states were allowed to join. If you did join, you weren't allowed to join any other alliances that were contrary to the parameters of the Warsaw Pact. So essentially, it meant that the Soviet Union controlled you. You couldn't join you couldn't join NATO, for example. So it meant that you ceded that element of your sovereignty essentially to Moscow. It was to work initially for a 30-year term, which was renewable. And it did renew itself in 1985. Obviously shortly before it was defunct, but that initial 30-year term, and then it did renew itself. And there was a joint command set up for NATO, which of course had to be in Moscow. So, it basically, although the narrative that is given is that this is, essentially defensive, what it is Moscow cementing its control, both in terms of foreign policy and military policy and, military forces and so on, cementing its control over its satellite states. And crucially, it's reaction to not only the events, in Germany, as we mentioned, but also, as you said before, that slight wobble that the Soviet world had after Stalin's death, and then the sort of
Yeah.
the wrangles around Khrushchev and Malenkov and all the rest of them. This is a formalization of Soviet control at a time when perhaps that formalization was needed or perceived to be needed.
When it could have been a moment for the countries that had come under Stalin's curse, as Robert Galateley calls it in his book, to find ways of kind of breaking free. And actually, funnily enough, the year after, it is a kind of tumultuous year. So the Warsaw Pact does not actually solve what perhaps its Soviet, the Soviet, those who were kind of created it from the Soviet side,
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily solve the problem they've got, which is that there is a massive Stalin-shaped hole at the center of the whole project.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that
And
the following year, like you said. I mean, 56,
yeah,
you've got the secret speech, which triggers essentially, the Polish Octobers, the Polish revolt in 56, and then of course Hungary in 56.
Hungary.
So that's the real wobble, is on the back of the secret speech. But so in a sense, that is maybe retrospective justification in a way for the Warsaw Pact. Maybe it was they viewed it as necessary for that reason.
The historian Władysław Zubok,
Yeah.
he has brought out the most recent history of the Cold War, the world of the Cold War. In that, he says that the Warsaw Pact, although an unwilling alliance, is a step towards sovereignty for Eastern European countries. But
Yeah.
we're not wildly
No.
convinced by that argument.
No, I mean that's a very sort of Russo-centric view, I think. I
It's one of
don't
those
think.
cases where that's what the Soviets are saying, right?
Yeah,
But that doesn't
yeah.
mean it means what it said. The whole point of
The whole point
Soviet
is the
doublespeak.
opposite. Is absolutely the
Yeah,
opposite. And I
whatever they
think,
say, it's normally the
yeah, I mean,
opposite.
anyone that's listening to this, in Central Europe, I mean, any of my sort of Polish friends and so on, if they listen to this, they'll laugh if they heard that, because that's completely
Mm,
not what it is. It's the opposite of that. So I think that's a very
mm.
kind of Russian view, and maybe he's just sort of, he's swallowed a bit too much, Kremlin Kool-Aid. Um, yeah, so it's really isn't that. It is the exercise of Soviet control over those satellites. And there's an interesting quote from Adam Ulam, who did a brilliant, one of the greatest, I think, one of the best books on Soviet foreign policy. It's quite old now, but it's very good. And I checked what he said about it, and he said, um, essentially, he said, it's preposterous to imagine that the elaborate machinery of joint command, i.e. Warsaw Pact, made any real difference. But Eastern Europe stood at the Kremlin's disposal, right? This is what he's saying. It absolutely is,
Yeah.
cementing that power relationship. So that's the sort of crucial aspect, I think. So anyway, so you've got these, they all sign up. There's this mutual defense aspect, so it kind of mirrors NATO. It's also very offensive. So the later, by the time that the Warsaw Pact dissolves itself, which is 1991, a lot of the sort of the plans and so on from the 1980s for attacks west, which were supposed to be in response to a NATO first strike, to clarify, explained, which armies were going to take which bits. I remember that the Polish army was supposed to take Denmark. That was their target. So the East Germans obviously would go across, they had to try and get to the Rhine, basically. But the Poles in particular had to take Denmark. That was a nice little detail, I remember. There are a couple of important sort of defections. The Albanians left the Warsaw Pact in 1968 in protest at the Prague Spring, at the crushing of the Prague Spring. The Romanians did not take part in 1968 in the crushing of the Prague Spring, and subsequently kind of maneuvered themselves a little bit out as well. But this leaves us, Prague Spring is kind of instructive here. So when in 56, when the Budapest's thaw is crushed, that's done by the Red Army. It's not done technically by the Warsaw Pact, right? But the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968 is done by the Warsaw Pact, right? So they all invade, with the exception of Romania. They all invade Czechoslovakia. So it leaves us with the weird situation that this is the only defensive alliance in history whose only military action was to invade itself.
Listen, Roger Moorhouse, we started this episode with a very apt Soviet metaphor, and now we're ending it with a very sort of apt Soviet moment. So listen, thanks for that. Tour de force on this day, 1955, the signing of the Warsaw Pact. Thank you very much.